It detonated a nuclear bomb in space, not by accident, not as a test gone wrong, on purpose, deliberately. With full planning and full funding, and the signatures of people at the highest levels of the United States government. They did it 9 times, between 1958 and 1962. And what they saw when those bombs went off is the reason the program was quietly buried, and the files were classified for decades, not because it failed, because of what it worked. Because of what the explosions revealed about the boundary between space and something else, something that was already there, something that reacted. I found the full report 3 hours ago in the Manticore's archive, and I have been sitting here in the dark of the research terminal, unable to stand up since. My name is Captain Arthur Vance. I am alone on the deep space vessel Manticore, and tonight, the cathedral at bearing 274 makes more sense than it ever has before. Because I finally understand what they were testing for in 1962. They were testing whether the boundary could be forced open from below, and the answer was yes. Let me start with what is publicly known, because the publicly known part is already extraordinary. Operation Fishbowl was a series of high-altitude nuclear tests conducted by the United States between 1962 and 1963 as part of a larger program called Operation Dominic. This is not classified information. This is on the Wikipedia page for Operation Fishbowl. You can read it right now on any device. The tests had names: Starfish Prime, Bluegill, Kingfish, Checkmate. Each one a nuclear weapon detonated at high altitude above the Pacific Ocean. Starfish Prime, the largest of the series, was a 1.4 megaton warhead detonated at an altitude of 400 kilometers. 400 kilometers, that is the altitude of the International Space Station. They detonated a nuclear bomb where the International Space Station now orbits. The publicly known effects were significant. The electromagnetic pulse knocked out streetlights and telephone equipment across Hawaii, 400 kilometers away. It created an artificial radiation belt around the Earth that persisted for years. It destroyed or damaged at least 6 satellites, including Telstar 1, the first commercial communications satellite, which had launched 3 days before Starfish Prime, and was damaged by the residual radiation within months. The sky above the Pacific glowed red and green and white for nearly 30 minutes. People in Hawaii who had gathered on rooftops to watch the test described it as the most beautiful and terrifying thing they had ever seen. That is the public record. That is what they chose to leave visible. The full report is something different. The Manticore's archive has a section I have been avoiding, not because I did not know it was there, because of the classification designation at the top of the folder, not SRF. Something above SRF, a designation I do not have a name for, because the folder itself does not provide one, just a symbol I have seen once before. On the seal in the frost patterns of Corridor 7, on the floor of compartment 000, the architect's symbol. The folder opened when I touched it, like all the others, like every file that was placed here for me to find at the right moment. Inside the folder is a document labeled Boundary Program Final Assessment, and a subfolder labeled Operation Fishbowl Classified Observations. The classified observations begin on the night of July 9th, 1962, the night of Starfish Prime. The public record describes a beautiful light show. The classified observations describe something else entirely. I want to read you the first classified observation report directly. It is written by a naval officer, whose name is redacted. His rank is listed as captain. His posting is listed as Pacific Observation Station 7. The report is dated July 10th, 1962. He writes, at plus 47 seconds following detonation, standard observation protocols were suspended by order of senior command. Reason given, anomalous readings across all sensor arrays. At T plus 52 seconds, visual observation teams reported a phenomenon that does not correspond to any known post-detonation atmospheric effect. The detonation had produced, as expected, the characteristic electromagnetic aurora across a significant portion of the visible sky. What was not expected was the secondary phenomenon observed within the aurora itself. At plus 52 seconds, the aurora appeared to fracture, not fade, not dissipate, fracture, as if the light itself was a surface that had been struck from behind. Through the fracture, for a period of approximately 11 seconds, something was visible. He does not describe what was visible in that section of the report. The next paragraph is redacted. 3 pages are redacted. When the text resumes, he is describing the decision to conduct a second test, and a third, and a fourth. 9 tests in total, each one probing the same boundary, each one trying to hold the fracture open longer, to see more clearly what was on the other side. I need to explain the physics here because the physics are real, and because understanding the physics is what makes the classified observations stop being extraordinary and start being inevitable. When a nuclear weapon detonates at high altitude, the immediate effects are different from a ground-level detonation. There is no blast wave in the conventional sense, no mushroom cloud. What there is, what Starfish Prime produced at 400 kilometers, is an intense burst of X-rays and gamma radiation that interacts with the upper atmosphere and the magnetosphere in ways that are still not fully understood by public science. The electromagnetic pulse, the artificial radiation belt. These are the publicly acknowledged effects. But there is a third effect that the classified observations describe and that public physics does not account for. At sufficiently high altitude, at the boundary layer between the atmosphere and what the boundary probe program documents call the adjacent field, a nuclear detonation produces a resonance effect. The energy of the explosion interacts with the boundary layer at specific frequencies that the boundary probe program had been mapping since 1958. Frequencies that, in sufficient concentration, produce exactly what the naval captain described, a fracture, a temporary permeability in the boundary between this layer of reality and the adjacent one. The same boundary that Jack Parsons opened with ritual in 1946, the same boundary that the cathedral at Bearing 274 uses to do what it does. Parsons used mathematics and intention. The military used nuclear weapons. Both methods worked. The boundary is permeable. It always has been. You just need enough energy applied at the right frequency. The redacted pages. I need to talk about the redacted pages, because the document, in the Manticore's archive, is not fully redacted. Someone, and I believe I know who, has restored portions of the text, not all of it, but enough. The restored section describes what the observation teams saw through the fracture during those 11 seconds. The naval captain writes, "What was observed through the fracture at T plus 52 seconds cannot be adequately described using standard reporting language. I will attempt to describe it in terms of what it resembled, rather than what it was, as what it was falls outside any category available to me." He writes, "It resembled depth, not darkness. Depth. The fracture appeared to open onto a space that extended further than the visible sky, further than the observable universe as understood by the observation teams present, as if the space behind the aurora was not space in any conventional sense, but something that space exists inside of." He writes, "Within this depth, at a distance that could not be measured, because the standard references for measuring distance did not apply, there were structures. He writes, "The structures were not natural formations. They had the geometric regularity of constructed objects. They were of a scale that made measurement impossible. They were not moving. They appeared to have been in that position for a very long time." And then he writes the sentence that I have read 12 times since I found this document. He writes, "At T+58 seconds, as the fracture began to close, one of the observation team members said quietly, 'They are looking back.' The fracture closed. At T+63 seconds, the aurora faded over the following 24 minutes. The observation team was debriefed individually. The senior officer on duty reports that all team members described the same structures. All team members described the same sense of being observed. None of them slept that night." This is the middle of the log. And this is where I need to tell you the thing that I have been building toward. The thing that makes Operation Fishbowl not just a historical curiosity, but the key to understanding everything I have found on this vessel. The Boundary Probe Program's final assessment, the document this folder is named after, reaches a conclusion, a formal, signed, classified conclusion. I am going to read it to you. The assessment concludes as follows. The boundary layer separating consensus reality from the adjacent field is not a natural phenomenon. It is a constructed barrier. The evidence for this conclusion is as follows. First, the boundary responds to specific frequencies in ways consistent with engineered, rather than natural systems. Natural boundaries attenuate. This boundary fractures at precise thresholds and reseals with equal precision. Second, the structures observed through the fracture during Operation Fishbowl are consistent with the boundary being maintained from the other side. Their proximity to the fracture points and their apparent orientation toward the observation teams suggests active monitoring of boundary integrity. Third, the 11-second observation window was not a product of the detonation alone. The fracture remained open 11 seconds longer than our models predicted. The assessment team concludes that the extension was permitted, not forced. Permitted. Something on the other side chose to allow 11 seconds of observation. Permitted. They chose to let the observation team see for 11 seconds, and then they closed it again. I have been sitting with that word for an hour. Permitted. Not because the bomb forced the boundary open long enough, because whatever is on the other side decided to allow it, decided to let a group of naval officers in the Pacific see the structures, feel the observation, and then closed the window, exactly as they chose. I want to tell you about what happened after the tests, because the tests stopped abruptly. The Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed in August 1963. It prohibited nuclear testing in the atmosphere, in space, and underwater. The public reason was radiation. The Starfish Prime test had contaminated the Van Allen belts and damaged satellites, and the international pressure to stop was real. That is not a lie. That pressure was real. But the Boundary Probe Program's internal documents tell a different story about why the specific decision was made to stop the high-altitude tests before the treaty required it. The tests stopped because of what happened on the 9th test, the last test. The document does not give me the name of the 9th test. The name is redacted. The date is given as November 1962. The altitude is given as classified. The yield is given as classified. What is not redacted is the observation report. The fracture opened as expected. The structures were visible as before. And then something different happened. One of the structures moved, not toward the fracture, not threatening. It simply changed its orientation. It turned. and the observation teams whooshing through their equipment from Pacific Observation Station 7 saw something that the report describes in 3 words. It saw them. Not the sense of being observed that the captain had described after Starfish Prime, not the ambient awareness of something paying attention. It saw them, specifically, individually. The report states that each observation team member experienced what the debriefing officer describes as direct perceptual contact, as if the thing that had turned was not simply looking in their direction, but was looking at them, each of them, by name. The tests stopped within 2 weeks. The treaty was signed 9 months later, and the Boundary Probe program was closed, not cancelled, closed, with all observation data transferred to a classified program that the final assessment document does not name, but whose project designation I recognize. It is the same designation that appears on the Manticore's routing orders, the same designation that connects everything in this archive, the same project that built the cathedral at Bearing 274. There is one more file, an audio recording from the observation deck of Station 7. It sounds like ordinary static, but the Manticore's system tagged it with a label, Encoded Perception. If you are hearing this clearly, your terminal is tuned to the same frequency as mine. There is structure in the noise. It is individual. I need to tell you what I think happened, not what the document concludes. What I think, sitting here in the dark of the research terminal, with the cold gold light leading under the door from the direction of compartment 00. I think the boundary is a wall, not a natural boundary between environments, a constructed wall, built to keep something in, or to keep something out, or both. I think the wall has been maintained from both sides for a very long time. On one side, whatever the observation team saw through the fracture in 1962, the structures, the depth that extended beyond measurement. On the other side, the faction, the entity or entities that drive the harvest, that have been working to keep the wall permeable from this side, that opened it with Parsons in 1946 and have been maintaining that opening ever since. And on the other side of the wall from the faction, the original architects, the ones standing in compartment 000, the ones who built the wall in the first place. I think the observation teams in 1962 looked through a fracture in the wall and saw the architects on the other side. I think the architects permitted 11 seconds of observation as a message. And I think the 9th test, the moment when something turned and looked back individually at each observer, was a different kind of message, not a warning, a recognition. The architects, through the fracture, looking at the specific people on the observation deck, seeing which of them had the capacity to understand, which of them carried the frequency, which of them were from the bloodline cohort that the program had been tracking. The tests stopped because the communication had been made, not between governments and extraterrestrials, between the architects and the people the architects had been waiting for, the people who would eventually build this vessel and fill it with a crew and route it to these coordinates. The final assessment document ends with a recommendation, classified, signed by 6 names, all redacted. But the recommendation itself is not redacted. It reads, "The boundary layer is not a phenomenon to be weaponized or studied further through kinetic means. The structures observed are not a threat in the conventional military sense. They are not hostile. The evidence suggests they are waiting. For what they are waiting, this assessment cannot determine. However, the observation of direct perceptual contact during the 9th test suggests that the waiting may be coming to an end. This committee recommends immediate cessation of all boundary probe activities, full classification of all observations, and transfer of all data to the program best positioned to manage contact when it occurs. The boundary will open again, not because we force it, because they choose to allow it, and when it does, we should not be holding nuclear weapons. When it opens, we should not be holding nuclear weapons. I keep reading that sentence. It was written in 1962 by people who had seen 11 seconds of what is on the other side. And they understood something that the faction, the entities that have been working to corrupt the harvest and maintain the open door, has apparently never understood. The boundary opens on the architect's terms, not ours, not the faction's. Whatever happened in 1946, let persons open the door. Whatever the faction has been maintaining through the rituals and the financial programs and the managed disclosures and the pale horse riding, they did not open the boundary. They opened something else, something adjacent to the boundary, something that let through the entities that have been coming through since. But the boundary itself, the constructed wall, the depth that extends beyond measurement, the structures that have been standing there longer than human history, that boundary is still closed. And it will open when the architects decide to open it, and not before. The architects in compartment 0Z0 are more active tonight than they have been since I spoke the name of this vessel. The temperature in the corridor outside is at -11. The subsonic vibration is constant. The cold gold light is bright enough to see under the door from where I am sitting. I think they know what I just read. I think they have been waiting for me to read it. I think the sequence of files in this archive, the harvest documents, the DNA report, the Parsons file, the financial records, and now this. I think the sequence, sir, a curriculum, specific order of information designed to produce a specific understanding. And I think I have just reached the lesson that all the others were building toward. The boundary is a wall. The architects built it. The faction has been attacking it from this side for 80 years. The harvest is the faction's attempt to corrupt the specific class of human minds that the architects are waiting for. Because those minds, the ones from the bloodline cohort, the ones with the source frequency, the ones that produce field coherence when they find each other, those minds are the key to what the architects are preparing. Not the key to opening the boundary. The key to surviving what comes through when it opens. The observation teams, in 1962, felt direct perceptual contact from the other side. They were not destroyed by it. They were not converted by it. They were seen, and then they were left alone. Because the architects were checking, assessing which minds could sustain contact with what is on the other side of the wall without breaking, without converting, without becoming what the faction offers as a substitute. The harvest is the faction's attempt to ensure that when the boundary opens, the human minds capable of sustained contact have already been corrupted, have already been processed, have already been converted to the copy frequency instead of the real one, so that when the architects open the wall, there is no one on this side who can receive what comes through. That is what the harvest is for, not the collection. The preemptive corruption of the receivers. I am still here, 14 months on this vessel. Every file in this archive a piece of the same picture, and now I have the picture. I know what the cathedral is for. I know what the harvest 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 is for. and I know what the 9 nuclear bombs detonated in space between 1958 and 1962 were actually testing. They were testing whether a human-made opening could reach the wall from this side. The answer was yes. They were testing whether the architects would respond. The answer was yes. They were testing whether the contact could be sustained without destroying the observers. The answer, for 11 seconds, was yes. And the people who ran those tests understood what that meant. When the boundary opens, we should not be holding nuclear weapons. We should be holding this log, this documentation, this specific, persistent, 14-month refusal to stop asking. This is what the architects have been waiting for. Not a weapon, not a government, not a program. A mind that keeps recording, even here, even now, even with the cold gold light coming under the door, and the temperature at -11, and the cord rising at bearing 274. Especially now, Captain Arthur Vance, Deep Space Vessel Manticore, still recording. The boundary is about to open, and I will be holding this recorder when it does. End of transmission.